Good morning, good day, good evening, good night, whenever you're listening to this. Welcome to week 4 of the fall 2024 semester for UB Soc 100 section 1. So as you should know by now, the Moodle layout in my course might be a little different from your other instructors, but this is laid out so that we can keep a flow going throughout the semester. This is currently week 4, and you have your first assignment that's due, which is essentially a quiz that will show you what the format or layout of your upcoming midterm exam is, as well as cover some basic points from the syllabus and other aspects of the course that I would like to know that you know. So one of those issues is that your midterm exam will be hosted on Moodle. It'll be covering primarily information out of the textbooks that I go over in lectures or indicate in lectures or on Moodle. You also have a writing assignment that is due that same week, and you need to familiarize yourself with the prompts, the directions. Email me if you have any questions about anything. I'll be more than happy to help you, but you need to do that at least 72 hours before the deadline. If you email me the day that the assignment is due, you can't expect me to give you information in an adequate amount of time for you to utilize it to complete your assignment. So you really have to do some planning and organization. And that's a general rule for anything. If you open my advice on writing guide, you'll see that my first piece of advice is to start your assignment as soon as possible. Do not wait until the last minute. I discussed that in more detail in this video here that I recorded a few years ago. You can skip to about 4 minutes in where I start discussing that. As always, in any of these recordings, you can speed up or slow down or watch as many times as you want the videos so that you can better familiarize yourself with my expectations. Okay, so this is week 4. You do have an assignment due. I explain that material here. You can ask me about anything you want in email. Give me about 24 hours to respond. Usually I respond a lot sooner than that. So far, I've been posting these shorts on Moodle, and the idea is that you click into them, watch them, but more than that, I want you to be looking at the comment section. So if you go into the video itself, you can make comments if you want, or thumb up. You can thumb down. There's people who do that from time to time. But really, I want you to look at the description. So if you click right down here at the bottom, you'll see that the full lecture is linked there. There's other material linked to in the course playlist. All you have to do is copy and paste that. It's a very simple process. So as you can see on your screen, now I'm at the full lecture. So that lecture is 15 minutes. So really, some of the lectures are shorter, some of them are longer. Today's is going to be a bit longer. So I do hope that you are staying with them until the end. Okay, so we need to jump into the material for the course that I would like you to go over, read, study, review for your upcoming midterm exam. So all of this information that's presented in these videos is going to be utilized for your upcoming midterm exam. Okay, so getting right into the material, you know that the topic of this course is about globalization. The first place that David Newman covers this is on page 23 in this section where he talks about social structure in a global context. At this point, you should really be aware of the idea that what we're doing is studying sociology, studying globalization from the sociological perspective, that the sociological perspective gets away from these individualistic explanations. We want to develop our sociological imagination so that we can start studying social behavior, social organization, institutions, culture, and other aspects of social structure, particularly in this course as it relates to globalization. So you need to understand that social structure includes everything from where we come in as individuals with our positions in society, the expectations that our positions have, our interactions with other people within small groups, within kind of medium-sized groups of about 10 to 15 to 20 people. Once you start going up with the number of people in terms of actual groups, we tend to get into the nature of organizations, which are large secondary groups that are comprised of people whose statuses are related based upon our formal agreements to accomplish some goal. So your status as a student and my status as a teacher come together in the organization of the University of the Bahamas so that we can carry out some of the functions for the institution of education. So the social institutions that we have are much smaller in number than the number of organizations that we have. There are a dozen, maybe 24 social institutions, but thousands and millions of organizations and many more groups. And this is one of the ways that we think in terms of social structure. So chapter 9, as is alluded to in chapter 2, goes into much more depth. And chapter 9 leads up to this idea of globalization and social institutions. So what's going on all across the planet as our social institutions become much more homogenized or uniform, where we see the same patterns start to unfold and bear themselves into reality all across the planet, whereas for most of human history, humans lived in small groups and tribes and relatively small communities that had their own unique languages and customs and norms and values and beliefs, or maybe similar beliefs, but really kind of encapsulated in different patterns of religion or different patterns of self-government or imposed governmental structures. So in our contemporary day and age, the institutions of economics, of education, and of religion are starting to become more similar across the planet. So for example, in terms of religion, we see the largest religions in the world are Abrahamic, monotheistic traditions of Christianity and Islam, with Judaism being much smaller in its numerical constitution. But we see polytheistic religions like Hinduism, Buddhism. It's much more of an atheistic religion, though there is a appreciation of the divine sacred elements. And then a growing segment of the population are unaffiliated, agnostic, or even atheistic. So education, for example, is becoming much more uniform across the planet with this kind of top-down Prussian model of education where you have one instructor, lecturer, teacher, many students. So this kind of mass education where standardized tests are pretty much the dominant metric by which we gauge students and performance. Now, this isn't something that is natural or encoded in our genes or was always going to be the product of the unfolding of the material universe. This is a process that unfolded due to the rational imposition of bureaucratic ways to handle problems in society, which is how do you transmit information from one generation to the next, and then how do you evaluate not just the performance of students, but the performance of schools, school districts, and nations as a whole. So standardized tests really allow us to achieve those goals. And ultimately, what's going on is that we have to have a way to feed ourselves, to clothe ourselves, to provide for housing, transportation, communication, and some other essential needs of humanity. And the social institution of the economy or economics is always the way that is going to happen. Now, whether or not you have political interventions or the degree to which there are political steps towards managing the society is another story altogether. The essential nature of economics is how to economize or to produce and distribute goods and services efficiently. So currently we have a large-scale organizational structure that we call the multinational corporation that does quite a bit of the production of goods and services around the planet. So multinational corporations are a way that meeting our basic needs are becoming more uniform across the globe. And a lot of times those multinational corporations have their origins in the United States of America, in Europe, in Japan, in South Korea. And so we have corporations like Microsoft or Google or Ford and GM or Toyota and Hyundai and Honda and Sony and some other, major multinational corporations that provides for some of our basic needs of transportation, communication. Think about like apparel lines where the fashions come out of Europe and the United States, but the garments and the fabrics are made somewhere in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia, in South America. So some of those issues are taken up in this section, and as you can see here, are later covered in chapter 10. For the time being, I want to get back to this idea of not just how organizations and social institutions affect globalization, but back to this broader question of how it is that social structure affects this thing that we call society. So in a previous lecture, I asked if you've ever thought about what this word society means. And, like, is society just a bunch of people who consider themselves to, be a nation or a country or something like that? Sociologists, to varying degrees, would have some issues with that. There are human beings who are born every day. There are human beings who die every day. Yet this thing that we call society persists with or without them. And in large part, society's social structures tend to be reproduced by new members and after other members die or become deceased. So this question of society, or you can think of it like nations in terms of our current dominant organizational form of the nation state, is kind of a different thing altogether than just groups or organizations or institutions. So society would be the totality of all the things that a population of humans do when they share an identity, a culture, a history, heritage, and a ruling or dominating system of government. So when we start discussing things like power, authority, and domination, we're necessarily entering into the discussion the issue of social stratification. So social stratification is something that we can think about in terms of the hierarchies that exist in terms of ranking entire categories of people. So in the definition in your book, it says ranking of entire groups of people, but in chapter 2, we already define groups of people as people who interact regularly and define themselves as a group. So, like a team like the Bulls or the Mingos, or a set of coworkers or a set of classmates, a fraternal order like the Rotary Club or the Freemasons, are a group of people. They know each other, they interact with each other, they have an identity. So in terms of this definition, I would say categories of people. And there are different ways that categories of people are ranked in society. And when we talk about a ranking, we're talking about hierarchical systems. So some people have more privileges, some people have more prestige or esteem or regard, and some people have more power and authority. Some people have more wealth and income. And all of those things tend to blend together in terms of who has more resources, who has fewer resources. So in our course playlist, you can see that I have a section on stratification and global stratification. The difference is that every society on the planet and in known history is stratified in some way, whether it's in our modern form in terms of social class systems under capitalist, Western industrialized systems, under some form of caste system based upon religion, like in India, or based upon the political economy, like in socialist and communist countries. There's some type of ranking of people. Take a look at these videos so that you can find out more about how sociologists study and think about systems of stratification at the societal or at the global level. But keep in mind that, like any other issue, there are competing perspectives. At the introductory sociology level, we have two main perspectives on social stratification: the structural functionalist perspective and the conflict view of stratification. Most contemporary sociologists take the conflict view of stratification, in particular, the Marxian and the neo-Marxian points of view. A different way of looking at stratification would be Max Weber's point of view on it, which adds in some complexity and some other points of view on what social class is, and in particular, this issue of power. If we go back to chapter 2, we can see that there are 3 perspectives on social order, at least at the introductory level. two of which are useful for studying globalization because they're at the macro level as opposed to the micro level. The three introductory sociological perspectives are indicated in this table: the structural functionalist, conflict, and symbolic interactionist perspectives. And notice the key concepts. Those associated with the conflict perspective are about inequality, power, dominance, and conflict, whereas structural functionalism deals with structures of society and what their functions are. So hence structural functionalism. The key one for the structural functionalist perspective are latent functions or unintended consequences. You can see in this section of the course playlist that I have several videos on unintended consequences. These will help you better understand what happens when large-scale decisions are made that affect many different people in society. And notice a particular social structure involved in unintended consequences are bureaucracies. And that's due to the nature of bureaucracies. So as David Newman discusses here, there are several examples of unintended consequences of bureaucratic policy-making decisions in which people's lives were negatively affected. So our two main macro-level perspectives we'll use to study social stratification, the structural functionalist and conflict perspectives, can both be used to analyze negative consequences of purposive social action. So societies are ranked into different groups, more or less consciously. In fact, it would be very difficult to say that slavery or the caste system are manifestations of unconscious stochastic decision-making that sort of arise emergently just from the way that people interact. That would be more like a market situation where we have the products of random social interactions that are produced from the epiphenomenal buying and selling decisions of people in the marketplace. So let's think a little bit more clearly about social systems of stratification in social structural terms. Systems of slavery have clearly defined statuses and roles where you have masters and enslaved persons. If you think about ascribed versus achieved statuses, such as defined and discussed here, you can begin to discuss more nuanced positions of whether or not and how people become enslaved in terms of something that they did, such as going into debt slavery, in which you'd have the achieved status of being an enslaved person, somewhat like indentured servitude, versus ascription systems in which some of your other ascribed statuses would define your legalized ability to be owned by other human beings. But let's think about this in an even more nuanced global perspective. For this, you can look to this section in the course playlist in which several different scholars discuss the broad nature of global slavery from a historical perspective, taking into account the various political, cultural, and economic systems both behind slavery and emancipation. In particular, pay attention to Dr. Phil Magnus's lecture that he gave at the University of the Bahamas. Consider also what David Newman has to say about sex trafficking, as well as what George Ritzer has to say about trafficking in the sex industry, starting on pages 276 going through 277 in chapter 11. You can see this section of the course playlist in which there are several videos indicating that what Newman and Ritzer both talk about in terms of sex trafficking throughout the world are covered in terms of Peter Nygaard's operations in the Bahamas, as well as the sex tourism industry in various parts of Asia and other parts of the world. So there are four broad systems of stratification that are discussed in the Newman textbook. These are slavery, the caste system, the estate or feudal system, and the class system. Notice what's missing is any discussion of stratification in socialist and communist societies. And it's not because those societies were not stratified. It's likely because the author of your textbook prefers to actually take the Marxian and the neo-Marxian point of view when it comes to discussing stratification. So it's possible that he just doesn't want to indicate that there was any types of stratification in societies that implemented Marxian ideas. In terms of social class systems, one difference between them and caste and class and estate systems is this idea of social mobility, in which you can move up and down into the class ranking system. By virtue of you taking part in education, you're trying to increase your social ranking. Now, that would be through what Max Weber called your socioeconomic status, the relationship between your level of education, your occupational prestige, your income, and your wealth, as well as maybe your power and authority within the workplace or in different aspects of society. So this differs in contrast to a Weberian model where they think about social class more in lines of a caste type of situation in which your relationship to the means of production defines your class position. You either own the means of production, in which you are a capitalist or bourgeoisie, or you must sell your labor in terms of being a proletariat or a worker. Now, there are lots of problems with this because there are different positions that one might have, such as being a relatively high income bureaucrat with authority within the workplace and maybe some social influence, but you don't own the means of production. And the neo or new Marxist models took this into account because there's lots of complexities and some contradictions within the old Marxian model, as well as several of Marx and Engels' predictions that just didn't bear out. So you have what are considered to be contradictory class locations within the old Marxian model that I just discussed. So being a supervisor, a manager, or even being a stockholder or a high paid physician in which you have high income, high wealth, high prestige, but relatively little power to influence other people. And also think about government bureaucrats who have high incomes and high power and authority, but they don't own any means of production. So that's one reason why neo-Marxian models had to be developed. Weber's model is a contrasting or competing way of thinking about social stratification as opposed to the Marxian models. However, in chapter 2 of Newman, when the conflict perspective is first introduced to you, it's introduced in terms of Karl Marx, perhaps the most famous scholar associated with the conflict perspective, who focused exclusively on economic arrangements. And Max Weber is discussed nowhere in here. So this is a clue to me that the author of your book, David Newman, is much more interested in the Marxian approaches, especially considering that there are 2 Marxian perspectives in chapter 10, when stratification is discussed, and Weber is not discussed in terms of introducing you to the conflict perspective in chapter 2. This to me indicates sort of a bias. And speaking of biases, in the table of contents from George Ritzer's book, let's look more closely at chapter 2. Chapter 2 is on theorizing globalization. Anytime you see that word theory or theoretical or theorizing, just substitute the word explain. We're basically explaining, hopefully from a scientifically grounded or fact-based or evidence-based position. Notice at the end of chapter 2, Ritzer talks about neo-Marxian perspectives. If you know anything about how to build an argument, what you do is you lead up to the position that you want to take or that you want your audience to take. So Ritzer is moving you through chapter 2 from a discussion of imperialism and colonialism, which really are rooted in Marxian and neo-Marxian perspectives. And then he leads you up to a neo-Marxian perspective. So there's the connection between chapter 2 in Ritzer and chapter 10 of David Newman. And this goes back to the conflict perspective, where Marx is perhaps the most famous scholar. But if we get into chapter 1 of George Ritzer, we'll see that the way that he conceptualizes the metaphors that he uses to discuss globalization come from a specific source. And I want to point out right now that this is Karl Marx. So on page 5, Ritzer says that Karl Marx opened the door to this kind of analysis. What kind? Well, the use of concepts and metaphors that track directly back to Marx when he famously said that everything solid melts into air due to industrial capitalism. So Marx is writing in the mid to late 1800s, and he was analyzing the rise of industrial capitalism, which was a fairly new way of organizing human social affairs. And Marx really, really disagreed with the way that people were organizing these economic affairs because he saw everything in terms of economics and that capitalism was an inherently exploitative system. We should really question that in terms of people's voluntary choices to sell their labor to employers. Like, why not voluntarily decide to open up your own business or to produce your own means of survival as opposed to choosing to sell your labor? So this goes back to the idea of what differentiates slavery from other systems, primarily the class system. So let me make one more direct connection with you from the conflict perspective, its association with Karl Marx, how in chapter 10, David Newman gives 2 sections on Marxian and neo-Marxian models, one section on Weberian models, even though there are neo-Weberian models, and spends several pages on the conflict perspective of stratification in total, where he only spends about 2 pages, page and a half, on the structural functionalist view of stratification. So when you're reading, one thing to pay attention to is how much dedicated space and time are given to any concept or theorist or way of explaining the world. And that can kind of tell you where it is that the author's biases lead. So let's think about one thing real quick from David Newman before we get back into George Ritzer. And that's if David Newman is going to say that Karl Marx focused exclusively on economic arrangements. If Newman is going to say that Marx is perhaps the most famous scholar associated with the conflict perspective and that he focused exclusively on economic arrangements, and if he's going to define globalization as increasingly interdependent lives economically and politically, then maybe we should question why in chapter 9, where he tells us to go to see more detail, in the section on globalization and social institutions, he spends several paragraphs and pages on economics and gives no discussion at all to politics, even though he defined globalization in terms of political arrangements and connections. So my supposition is that it's because one perspective on stratification is the Weberian perspective, which competes with the Marxian perspective, and that's the perspective that includes an analysis of power and politics and bureaucracy. So Newman, for whatever reason, doesn't want to discuss that. Moreover, when introducing you to the conflict perspective, Newman discusses that Marx is the most famous scholar and associates it with economics. So then we go to George Ritzer, and he says that Marx is the source of my metaphors and ideas that I use to conceptualize globalization. This indicates that, this is probably a pretty important guy, especially considering that in chapter 2, he dedicates an entire section on neo-Marxian theories. But along the way, what he does is introduces you first and foremost to a specific type of globalization, which is economic globalization. This is yet another indication that George Ritzer, along with David Newman, really favors this Marxian point of view. And whether you think it's coming from a neutral place or that Marx had the best or most objective or analytic perspective, that's up for you to decide. I'm just saying that a lot of contemporary sociologists take the conflict perspective. In particular, they take the Marxian or neo-Marxian perspectives, and it's clearly spelled out in black and white, especially if you learn how to read between the lines. But we don't really need to read between the lines. Let's compare 2 statements. First, look at what Newman says when he introduces the conflict perspective. He's saying, unlike the structural functionalist perspective, the conflict theorists think that society and social order doesn't arise out of the societal pursuit of harmony and cooperation, interdependence, integration, interrelatedness. No, it's nothing like that. It's domination and coercion, control and exploitation. It's power differentials that define social order and social relations. The family, government, religion, and other social institutions foster and legitimate the power and privilege of some individuals and groups at the expense of others. It's very similar to the way that George Ritzer leads into his discussion of economic globalization. Again, economics being the particular focus of Marxian theorists. So Ritzer goes so far as to say the history of the social world and social thought and research. So everything that we know about everything leads us to the conclusion, so only one conclusion, that people as well as their representatives in the areas in which they live. So think about the definition of society, like society being that population of humans who share a geography, an identity, a culture, and also a governing body, which differentiates the nation from the state, have always sought to erect structural barriers to protect and advance themselves and to adversely affect others. And it seems highly likely that they will continue to do so. So the people who want to exploit, marginalize, control, and dominate, and commit violence in order to achieve their goals, erect social structural barriers preventing people from moving up, as well as social structural conditions that benefit themselves at the expense of others. And this is going to happen into the future unless something is done about it. And that's something that we'll explore in future lectures. But right now, I want to start indicating to you that the sources of your information do tend to go down a certain route when it comes to the available theories of explaining the social world around us. Those tend in large part to be the conflict perspectives. In particular, they mostly take the Marxian or neo-Marxian points of view. And the clear indication of this is the prevalence of conflict points of view throughout both Newman and Ritzer's books, as well as a particular focus in Ritzer's book on neo-Marxian perspectives, as clearly spelled out in chapter 2. But I want to point out that both Ritzer and Newman are familiar with Max Weber's work. He was a very famous social theorist. In particular, Newman, Max Weber, is discussed in terms of bureaucracies. And again, one of the ways that he's discussed is not just the bureaucratic structure and form, that there's a hierarchy of authority. So people at the top of an organization have more power and control and authority over people at the bottom, that there's a division of labor. You have to have specialization and different people doing different jobs in order to increase efficiency. But these unintended consequences of large-scale purposive actions are important. So that's discussed in page 168 in terms of governmental actions that have been taken that negatively affect people's lives, because what tends to happen are these one-size-fits-all, quote-unquote, solutions are proposed that necessarily cannot take into account specific situations or unique circumstances that individuals face, or when individuals are faced with disruptions due to disasters or catastrophes of some type. If you have a set of social policies designed around the existing status quo of the social order of the time, when disruptions or unclear circumstances arise, sometimes those policies don't really take into account the circumstances that are created when a war, a famine, or a recession, or a disaster takes place. Now, when it comes to the structural functionalist perspective on social stratification, as laid out in chapter 10 of Newman, we're not so much here focusing on latent functions or unintended consequences, but more so on the manifest, the purpose of the social institutions, manifest functions. So like the manifest function of the economy is to allocate efficiently the production and distribution of goods and services. So here we can think about the distinction between garbage collectors and physicians. So I'm not making this example up. This is a pretty classic example. Like, think about who is needed more in society. Does society need physicians or garbage collectors more? If you had to choose one of these professions to annihilate or obliterate from the planet, which one would you choose? Physicians or garbage collectors? But think about this. If you get rid of all garbage collectors, can you rely upon people or individuals to take their garbage or refuse to a garbage dump? Or like, who's even operating the garbage dump? How are we going to have widespread sanitation? So if we had a very unsanitary environment, because all garbage collectors are done away with in some way, shape, or form, at least we still have physicians to take care of all the sick people. But the fact that we have a lot of sick people means that we have to have a lot more physicians, which means that there would be people taken out of other sectors. So maybe it's all the people who could have been garbage collectors. But think about this. How much education does it take to become a physician? Probably a lot. And what motivates people to go through all the necessary schooling? It's probably the high income and high prestige associated with being a physician. Garbage collectors, they make a living wage, but they don't have as much prestige or power and authority as physicians do in society, that's for sure. But think about this. Let's say that a physician and a garbage collector are fired on the same day. Therefore, job opening for each position open on the same day. Which one of those people can take the other one's job? Can a garbage collector become a physician the day after losing their job? Could a physician become a garbage collector the day after losing their job? The question answers itself. So kind of in a hypothetical sense, maybe you think that garbage collectors are less functional for society than physicians. But maybe take into account that there's a whole insurance industry dedicated to providing insurance for malpractice when people die or suffer more diseases if and when they go into a hospital or under surgery? How many people do garbage collectors kill or induce into some type of disease like meningitis or some type of bacterial infection from like a staph infection? So it's kind of unclear like what the functional necessity of different occupations are in the regard to what people value in terms of what pay allocation we're willing to make towards professions. Sometimes it has to do with how much do you have to sacrifice on education, how much skill do you have to perform the task. So in terms of a structural functionalist perspective on stratification, we're thinking about things like statuses and why it is that there are resources allocated to certain status or occupational positions. So like for unpaid status positions, like being a full-time stay-at-home parent who are unpaid, are those positions, necessary or important? Well, maybe if we have full-time teachers through the pre-K, kindergarten, grade school, and high school levels, we don't need parents to be stay-at-home teachers. And I'll tell you this right now, that if the conflict theorists see the family, government, religion, and other institutions like education as fostering legitimating inequality, especially when Marx himself said that the family needs to be abolished and education needs to be universal to provide for what the family used to provide before it was abolished, then you can kind of get to see some of the underlying impetus of these different theoretical perspectives. Whereas the structural functionalist perspective sees all of these social institutions as being necessary for carrying out the order of society. Some of the conflict theorists want to abolish them and restructure society because of what they see as the inherent inequalities. So again, the conflict perspective and the structural functionalist perspective, as indicated in chapters 2 and 10 in your course textbook, take very different approaches to studying this thing that we call society. In chapter 9, some of the social structures that are indicated in chapter 2 are laid out in much more detail. I want you to ask yourself, though, why it is that when Newman is discussing globalizations in social institutions, he spends so much time discussing economics and absolutely no time at all discussing politics, even though in chapter 2, when he says, see chapter 9 for more detail, he defines globalization in terms of politics, but then gives no discussion to it. I think it's because his biases lie in his Marxian preferences, and he does a little bit better of a job than I think Ritzer does. But again, be aware of this stuff when you're reading the course material. Okay, so that's enough for now. I'll see you next time in the follow-up lecture to this.